The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute series of distinguished lectures on the American Bicentennial. To help celebrate the 200th anniversary of our nation, the AEI has gathered some of the country's leading scholars and educators to share with us their views on the American Revolution and how it still affects us all today. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a part of the AEI's continuing effort to open the major issues of our times to serious discussion from several points of view. The AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution located in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture comes from Greenfield Village and the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, which preserves many American contributions to science and to industry. Greenfield Village and the museum were founded by Henry Ford in 1929 as a tribute to the genius of Thomas Edison. But over the years, they have expanded to honor the works of many American inventors and craftsmen. On October 21, 1929, a train like this pulled up to the station in Greenfield Village bearing some important passengers, President Herbert Hoover, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford. Waiting to meet them were such people as Orville Wright, Madam Curie, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr. They were all gathered to join Mr. Ford in dedicating his museum and historic village. The ceremonies were broadcast to the world. Edison recreated the lighting of his first successful incandescent lamp, which occurred 50 years before. Today, many of Edison's original electric lights are still on display at the museum. And so is Edison's first phonograph, a far cry from today's quadraphonic high fidelity, but it was this device that started it all.
Mary had a little lamb, its feet was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
The light bulb, the phonograph, and hundreds of other devices were invented at Edison's laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. As part of Greenfield Village, Henry Ford had the entire laboratory building moved to Michigan, where it was restored to its condition during the period of its greatest productivity in the latter part of the 1800s. The actual homes and workplaces of other great Americans have also become a part of Greenfield Village. This is the cycle shop from Dayton, Ohio, owned by the Wright brothers, where they did much of their work in the development of the first successful airplane. This is the house in which Henry Ford was born in 1863. It was built by his father, William, in Dearborn, Michigan, a typical Midwestern farmhouse of the period. This is the Logan County Courthouse, used by Abraham Lincoln when he traveled the state of Illinois as a young attorney in the 1840s. But Thomas Alva Edison is still the central figure of Greenfield Village. Probably the greatest and certainly the most prolific inventor in history, Edison was granted 1,093 patents during his lifetime. In addition to the electric light and the phonograph, Edison invented duplicating machines, the stock ticker, the motion picture camera and projector, and hundreds of other devices that enabled America to lead the way in the Industrial Revolution. At Greenfield Village today, our American Enterprise Institute speaker, Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset, will discuss the American political revolution, the anniversary of which is being celebrated in this bicentennial lecture series. Dr. Lipset will speak on equality and welfare, a revolutionary value. He is being introduced by Michigan State Senator Patrick McCullough.
Our speaker really, within his field in the discipline of sociology and political science, is a pioneer. He is one of those men who has turned an art, the art of politics and the study of it, from a level of armchair conjecture to a true science where measurement is capable of being accomplished. He is, therefore, a creator of knowledge and a giant in his field. For those few of us in the real world of public affairs where decisions are made daily and hourly in a somewhat harried atmosphere, it's particularly comforting to know that scientific techniques of measurement are being applied to politics, to our government, and to its function. Our speaker tonight is an expert in that area. His background should give you an inkling of the kind of depth and knowledge of the American people which he possesses. I'm sure those impressive credentials will be reflected in his remarks tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset.
Thank you, Senator McCullough. I'm pleased to be here in a city, community, and a building which commemorates one revolution, the Industrial Revolution, to discuss the implications of the broader political revolution that we're celebrating in this bicentennial series. Some years ago, in a book from which I've drawn heavily for this lecture, I suggested that the United States should properly be regarded as the first new nation. The Declaration of Independence was the first successful proclamation by a major colony in modern times of its intent to secede from the rule of a mother country. It set the lead for comparable actions within a half a century by most of the Spanish colonies in Central and South America. And of course, much more recently, in the last few decades, a variety of colonies in Africa and Asia proclaimed their independence, often in words drawn directly from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration. Born in a prolonged struggle for independence, the United States defined itself from its beginning in ideological terms. As many writers have noted, Americanism is an ideology, a set of integrated beliefs defining the good society. Some writers, such as Leon Sampson and Sidney Hook, have even seen a close resemblance between the ideology of Americanism and those advocated by socialists. Thus, Sampson, in a book written in the 1930s, which sought to explain why no socialism in the United States, why the United States was one of the very few countries which didn't have a mass socialist movement, argued that the basic factor weakening the socialist appeal is that the values of socialism and Americanism, property relations apart, which is, of course, obviously very crucial, are quite similar. When Americans celebrate their national heritage on Independence Day, on Memorial Day, or other holidays of this sort, they dedicate themselves anew to a nation conceived as the living fulfillment of a political doctrine that enshrines a utopian conception of man's egalitarian and fraternal relations with one another. In linking national celebrations with political events and a political creed, the United States resembles such other post-revolutionary societies as France, the Soviet Union, or many of the new states of the modern era. Nations whose authority stems from traditional legitimacy, from their ancient history, on the other hand, tend to celebrate holidays linked with religious tradition or a national military history, not with a political doctrine as such, which is typical of post-revolutionary societies such as ours and others. In newly independent societies, there has often been a transition from a system dominated by traditionalist, often aristocratic values, to one characterized by egalitarian and populist concepts. These new value systems are variously referred to as liberal, democratic, or leftist, in contrast to elitist, conservative, or aristocratic. The elitist ideology takes for granted the desirability of the hierarchical ordering of society, in which those who belong to the naturally superior strata exercise due authority and are given generalized respect. Social recognition rests on the sum of all the qualities of a person's status, rather than on a given role that he may be playing at the moment. In colonial situations, the native elites usually derive their status or were protected in it by virtue of their connection with the status and power of the foreign ruler. And with independence, the values of hierarchy, of aristocracy, of privilege, of primogeniture, and more recently of capitalism, all being associated with the foreign imperialist power, or easily rejected. Consequently, most struggles for independence have employed leftist ideologies, that of equality in revolutionary America, that of socialism in the contemporary new states. Men's status is to depend not upon inherited, but upon achieved qualities. Hence, the system must be geared to abolish all forms of ascriptive privilege and to reward achievement. Franchise is to be extended to everyone, the people being regarded as the source of power and authority. And various social reforms, such as economic development, the elimination of illiteracy, and the spread of education, are to reduce inequalities in status. The need to legitimate the democratic goals of the American Revolution made mandatory a commitment to improve sharply the economic circumstances of the mass of the population, even though the struggle for independence was conceived by many of its leaders as primarily concerned with the issue of political independence. Every revolutionary group proclaims doctrines such as all men are created equal or have inalienable rights, or it advocates a classless society and the elimination of minority rule in politics. However, behind this consistency of radical temper, there are profound differences in the ways in which the various parties or strata interpret their revolutionary commitments. In the United States, after the adoption of the Constitution, the conservative groups who had taken part in the anti-imperialist revolution continued to play a major, even a dominant role. The American Federalists, though convinced advocates of views which were radical and Republican by the standards of European states, sought to limit the application of egalitarian principles in such fields as property relations, religion, and the suffrage. But as in most of the contemporary new states, in which conservatives have tried to defend traditionalist values after independence, the more conservative parties soon lost office. The Federalists failed in their efforts to sustain a party which defended aspects of inequality, and their successors sought to learn from their errors. When conservatism revived in America, in the political form of the Whig opposition to Andrew Jackson, it had a distinctly new look. In attacking Jackson, the tribune of the plebs, the new conservatives tried to fix the title of Royalist and Tory on him, while it was the term Whig, the title of the opposition to Toryism and royal absolutism in Britain, that was taken by the American conservatives fighting King Andrew. The complete supremacy of egalitarian values in politics may be seen by the Whig behavior in the presidential elections of 1840, the first such contest they were able to win. Their candidates, Harrison and Tyler, were selected because they were not aristocratic. The party rejected Webster on the grounds that he was too upper class. This consideration showed how completely the old order had changed. The men of wealth well realized, now that liberty and equality had shown their power, that an enthusiastic profession of fraternity lay their only course of safety. Property rights were secure only when it was realized that in America property was honestly accessible to talent, however humble its early circumstances. The Whigs found it useful to disavow, as vehemently as they could, any and all pretensions to a caste superiority in political life. In presenting their candidate for governor in 1840, the New York Whigs described him as a true and worthy representative of democratic and Republican principles. Born in the forest of the noble western region of our own state, trained among an industrious kindred to hardy toil and manual labor on the farm and in the manufactory, democratic in all his associations and sympathies. Actually, many of the candidates of the Whig Party were gentlemen, men from some of the country's first families, but in keeping with the democratic spirit of the times, they campaigned on a ticket of fraternity and equality, even appealing to class hatred against the elite, which was basically themselves. It is important to place these events and doctrines in their historical context. American conservatives during the first half of the 19th century had come to recognize that, like it or not, they must operate within the context of a society in which egalitarian values were dominant, and in which both the rights of the people to govern and of the able to succeed must be accepted as inviolable. But the important fact is that for both the Democrats and the Whigs, the aristocratic, monarchical, and oligarchic societies of Europe were anathema. Both looked upon the United States as a new social order, which should be an example to the downtrodden of the rest of the world. Just as today competing parties in new states such as India or other countries which still have competing parties are almost automatically socialist, so the American political leaders in the first half century of our existence were instinctively Democrats. believing that the United States had a special mission to perform in introducing a new form of political order to the world. Some even felt it had an obligation to give moral, financial, and other forms of support to European radicals fighting for republicanism and freedom. The significance of leftism as characterizing the core values in the American political tradition may be best perceived from the vantage point of comparative North American history. That is, from the contrast between Canada, which is closely neighboring where we're now sitting, and the United States. For though American historians and political philosophers may debate how radical, liberal, leftist, or even conservative American politics has been, there is no doubt in the minds of Canadian historians. Looking at the divergent political history north and south of the border, Canadian historians see their nation as a descendant of the counter-revolution, and the United States as a product of the successful revolution. Once the die was cast, consisting of a triumphant revolution in the 13 colonies and a failure of that revolution in the northern ones, an institutional framework was set. Consequent events tended to enforce leftist strength in the South and a rightist bias in the North. The success of the revolutionary ideology, the defeat of the Tories, and the emigration of many of the Tories north to Canada or across the ocean to Britain all served to enhance the strength of the forces favoring egalitarian democratic principles in the new nation and to weaken conservative tendencies.
We are watching Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset discussing equality and welfare revolutionary values. Dr. Lipset is speaking from the Henry Ford Museum at Dearborn, Michigan. In just one moment, he continues. Not surprisingly, the Ford Museum has perhaps the most outstanding collection of vintage automobiles to be seen anywhere. Henry Ford's Model T, first introduced in 1909, became the first reliable, low-priced car ever available to the average man. And Ford's development of the moving assembly line in 1913 revolutionized the automobile business and just about every other business as well. If you're looking for something a bit more sporty than a Model T, how about this, the Stutz Bearcat? Or how about a spin in this 1931 Duesenberg? The doozy sold for over $8,500 during the Depression, but if you had the money, it was worth it. One of the finest passenger cars ever made, the Duesenberg could move from 0 to 100 miles an hour in 10 seconds, and it could hit 95 in second gear. And speaking of speed, Henry Ford designed and built this racing car in 1902. Ford himself pushed old 999 to over 90 miles an hour in 1904. The world-famous race driver Barney Oldfield broke several speed records in this car. The American lifestyle, which Henry Ford influenced to a major degree, is part of the subject matter being discussed by today's AEI lecturer, Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset.
Much of the social history of the United States, then, may be read in terms of an attempt to elaborate on the egalitarian promise of the Declaration of Independence. Before other countries, the United States expanded its suffrage to cover all white males. Slavery, of course, was its great exception and horror, and continued racism its Achilles heel. The United States led other nations in providing education to its inhabitants. The census of 1840 indicated over 90% of the whites were literate. Probably an exaggeration, but still much more than any other country possibly could claim at that time. But then and later, this country expended more public funds for education than did other societies. A much larger percentage of the appropriate age population attended secondary schools and institutions of higher learning in America from the 19th century down to the present than in any other country. In other words, education has been more equally distributed in the United States than in other countries for a century and a half. Further, a myriad of foreign observers, such as Tocqueville, Harriet Martineau, James Bryce in the 19th century, and others more recently, have commented on the emphasis in social relations on symbolic equality. They noted, in effect, that in America no man need doff his cap to another. But the symbols of rank present in Europe were absent in America. Populism and anti-elitism have characterized its political style. Most noteworthy of all in the American conception of equality, as we have seen, has been the stress on equality not of rank, status, income, or wealth, but of opportunity. The American ideal has predominantly been one of open social mobility, everyone starting at the same point in the race for success. The vigor of this doctrine of equal opportunity in early America may be seen in its most extreme form in the program of the workingmen's parties, formed in various eastward American cities in the 1820s and 1830s. These parties, which secured in some elections as much as 20% of the urban vote, were particularly concerned with education. In a profound document written in 1829, the New York Workingmen's Party anticipated the conclusions of a much later report by the sociologist James Coleman by asserting that access to equal education in day schools was far from sufficient to provide equal opportunity in the race for success. For, they said, a few hours in school cannot counter the highly unequal effects of varying culture and material environments supplied by families of unequal wealth and culture. They therefore proposed that all children, regardless of class background or parental wishes, be educated from 6 years of age on in boarding schools to assure that all had the same environment 24 hours a day. Clearly, this American political party made the most radical proposal ever advanced to nationalize not property, but children. Obviously, this policy was not popular and never came close to carrying. But the fact that a party which was a contender for public office and which did in fact elect representatives to various legislative bodies could even make such a proposal is indicative of the strength of egalitarianism a half-century following American independence. It is noteworthy that this party, which incidentally gave Karl Marx the idea that the working class could and should organize politically on its own behalf, never called for equality of wealth or income. This was never the meaning of equality in the content of Americanism, even to extreme radicals in those days. The working men of 1830 approved of inequality, as long as it was the result of success in a competitive race for the top. Close to a century later, a highly successful American multimillionaire, Andrew Carnegie, advocated a confiscatory inheritance tax in which all wealth returned to the state on death. Carnegie, like the working men, also believed that new ways should be found to equalize the race for success. Although the workingmen's parties did not secure boarding schools, the idea that all should begin with an equal education helped strengthen the more successful efforts of those who, like Horace Mann, urged the creation of publicly supported common schools in the 1840s. By common schools was meant what we now call integrated schools, that is, schools attended by children from diverse social backgrounds, natives and immigrants, rich and poor. The proponents of the common schools assumed that such schools were necessary to develop a common culture, to absorb those from varying backgrounds, to make possible more equality of opportunity, as well as to create the kind of citizenry who could participate in a one-man, one-vote democracy. The spread of the common school idea, it should be noted, included a practice which would have far-reaching consequences. These schools, designed in part to Americanize the immigrant, to civilize the underprivileged, deliberately set their educational sights at the levels of the culturally deprived. In a sense, they consciously lowered standards, or rather educational aspirations, from the values upper middle-class children could attain, so as to make it possible for those of deprived background to catch up. It was assumed that all would eventually reach higher levels of attainment of knowledge in the upper grades, and ultimately in college and university. This pattern has continued in U.S. education, so that worldwide comparisons today show that American youth study less or learn less than their equivalents in the upper level European gymnasia or lycées. The German sociologist Max Weber noted in 1918, the American boy learns unspeakably less, he said, than the German boy. By age 20, however, the Americans have more than caught up to the Germans and other Europeans, and a much greater percentage of Americans than those of any European country have secured higher education. By going slowly through elementary school and high school, the U.S. system has permitted many more to enter and graduate an institution of higher learning than has the European systems which stress elite education, special intensive education for those who are privileged enough to be able to benefit from it in the lower levels of education. It would be misleading to credit the growth of education and other educational practices fostering social mobility solely or primarily on forces stemming from an egalitarian political ideology. The ideology itself, the educational growth, and equalitarian social relations were fostered as well by the fact that so much of America was a rapidly expanding new society, a frontier culture in which all families were first settlers or their immediate descendants. In spite of its emphasis on equality of opportunity, the United States, of course, has never really approached the ideal, even in the spread of formal education itself. Two of the great 19th century radical thinkers, Karl Marx and the American single tax theorist Henry George, independently pointed out that publicly supported higher education in the United States involved taking money from the poor to subsidize the education of the well-to-do, that it was a negative transfer payment, so to speak. Henry George put the thesis in colorful terms when he said in the 1890s that the University of California is a place to which the poor send the children of the rich. Recent analyses by economists indicate that George is still right. In spite of the enormous spread of state higher education in California, well over 50% of the college-age population are in school in that state, the families of those who attend the University of California have a higher income than those who go to state colleges or junior colleges, who in turn are more affluent than the families whose children do not go on to higher education. Attendance at higher education, which has now reached close to 50% of the cohort nationally, still of course varies greatly with family income. Thus in 1967, 87% of those youth whose families earned $15,000 or more attended college, and only 20% from families with less than $3,000 a year income attended college. Yet this 20% figure for the very poor, for those with less than $3,000 income, is higher than the total figure for the whole country for most European nations. It should be obvious, however, that the diffusion of college education, and even the broadening of the social class background of those who hold privileged positions, does not demonstrate a leveling of income, wealth, or power in America or elsewhere. Christopher Jenks, in his recent book, Inequality, has properly emphasized that in spite of the growth of higher education, the distribution of wealth has not narrowed in the United States in recent decades. The evidence, in fact, does suggest that the distribution today is much more egalitarian than it was in pre-Civil War days, and that there was a narrowing in the period of the Depression and to some extent in the New Deal. But the sharply stratified distribution, which sees the lowest quartile, the lowest 25%, holding only 5% of the wealth and the highest tenth having about a third, still continues. Raymond Boudon, a French sociologist drawing on data from Western Europe and North America, has in fact shown that increases in education have the effect of widening the salary gap from the top to the bottom. Sharp inequality continues to characterize American society as it does all other complex social systems. Well-to-do parents in America are able to provide their offspring with a more academically stimulating environment, real assistance in the form of better schools and teachers, the motivation to attain success, and various forms of direct help in the ways of contacts and financial aid so that they can get started well in the race for success. Those who control large financial resources in this country, as in others, may convert these into various forms of power in affecting key decisions in the society. As in a different way may those at the summit of intellectually important and opinion-molding institutions. Race, ethnic, and class background may be less of a handicap in the race of success than in earlier times, but the inequality between those who succeed and those who do not, in terms of the return which they get, has not been reduced. The renewed contemporary fight for more equality, legitimated by the historic commitment in America to the ideal of equality, is still waged in terms of the old American emphasis on equality of opportunity, the demand of the Workingmen's Party that none be handicapped by reason of social origin in the race for getting ahead. Almost none of the battles, however, have ever been concerned with equality as such. Today, blacks and women are demanding their appropriate share of corporation presidencies, university professorships, government positions, and the like. They are not, however, arguing that the perquisites associated with these statuses be lowered or eliminated. Even the war on poverty proclaimed by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were basically presented as an extension of equal opportunity, not of equality as result.
Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset has been discussing the highlights of America's political and social development since the Revolution. In just one moment, he will continue. Much attention at the Ford Museum is given to the development of aircraft. This is the first successful helicopter, which set an in-flight endurance record in 1939 by staying aloft 1 hour and 33 minutes. The helicopter was designed by Igor Sikorsky, who flew it to the Ford Museum himself, where it is now on public display. This 1928 Ford trimotor was flown over the South Pole by Admiral Richard Byrd. The Trimotor was the first multi-engine, all-metal commercial passenger plane ever built. The fact that several are still in use today is a tribute to the design and construction of these planes, first built nearly 50 years ago. The development of air travel had a major effect on social and political life in America, the subject of Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset, today's AEI speaker.
To a considerable degree, the breakdown of urban services in many communities is a consequence of this need to pay for larger and larger welfare payments. Yet such payments have had little positive effect on the lives of the recipients. There is good reason to believe that in the absence of jobs, migrants from rural and economic depressed regions to the more developed areas would have been better off had they remained in the cultural surroundings to which they were accustomed. A possible solution to these developments is currently advocated by the spokesmen of both of our major political parties: the federalization of welfare and the direct payments to the needy. The Nixon administration's family welfare plan and the bills presented by some leading Democrats differ mainly in the mechanics and the amounts of money to be allocated immediately. Both, however, accept the principle of national responsibility and seek to reduce the tax burden of the cities, to cut down on the size of the bureaucracy administrating welfare, and hopefully by a set of financial incentives to encourage the poor to seek income in the labor market. The gradual acceptance of the community's responsibility for the underprivileged in America constitutes an important shift in our values away from the primary, almost sole focus on opportunity implied in the original achievement and Protestant orientations of the early republic. Yet it may be argued that the initial emphasis on equality derived from the Declaration of Independence, which has led many Americans to speak of their country as a classless society, serves to strengthen the new trends towards use of government power to eliminate poverty, once that concern has reached the political arena. I would like to devote some time at the end of this lecture to the problems posed by this change in emphasis. This change has found most concrete expression in proposals for the use of guaranteed quotas in jobs and social placement. It has made for a clear conflict of interest between those underprivileged who demand them and those who have obtained opportunity and success by the traditional competitive methods. The blacks and some other still depressed groups have a history of cumulative disadvantages, which have prevented them from attaining a proportionate share of various privileged positions. There is no easy or obvious way to resolve this conflict of interest. As Blau and Duncan and Jenks and his colleagues have demonstrated, the argument that different ethnic groups have found ways and means to attain status, power, and economic reward holds for almost all American white male groups, but not for blacks or women. Many recognize that the use of a pure quota system humiliates the group receiving such help and is a danger to the society in that it may permit unqualified persons to hold jobs. During the 1960s, public policy increasingly took note of the dilemma and tried to resolve it by various forms of affirmative action. The policy of affirmative action was in fact first proclaimed by President Johnson in an executive order in 1965. And in defending and explaining this policy, the image of a shackled runner has often been used, suggesting the image of a runner in a race who is shackled applies to the black man in America. And one cannot but agree that the black man has been shackled by his past by traditional forms of discrimination. But one has to also note that even if current forms of discrimination were eliminated, the ability to compete in American society is tied to a less visible chain of prior factors. For example, the work experience of family and friends, as well as educational achievement, which are themselves linked to the educational and cultural experiences of the family. For this reason, the progress of emerging groups that are underprivileged in America has always taken place over a span of generations. But we have to note, of course, that the oppression of the American black man has been imposed by this society, not by another society, as was the case of most other emerging ethnic groups in America. Thus, there is a special national responsibility for affirmative action for blacks. The need for affirmative action is strongly supported by various educational studies, which indicate that while the aspirations of black students tend to be as high as those of whites, their expectations are quite low. Many are convinced that their chances for success are small, regardless of how well they do in school and otherwise. This clearly has had negative effects on the ability of black children to study hard and learn, and on black adults to work well and persistently. Beyond these cultural handicaps, however, has been the fact that American society discriminated in the past against blacks even when they were qualified. Many major institutions in the North as well as the South either barred them for entry or limited their numbers to small token quotas. The segregated schools of the pre-Brown versus Kansas school integration decision by the Supreme Court were not separate but equal. They were separate and unequal. Limitations on black suffrage in the South, where most blacks lived, meant that they could not effectively resort to the classic democratic political remedy for maltreatment. Not surprisingly, black leaders turned to their only effective weapon, civil disobedience, which would have embarrassed authority into acting on their behalf. The first such effort in modern times, the March on Washington movement of World War II, led by A. Philip Randolph, forced Franklin Roosevelt to establish a Fair Employment Practices Commission. Providing a mechanism through which minority group members could appeal against apparent overt discrimination, such as hiring a less qualified white for a job, however, proved ineffective. There were not sufficient numbers of minority group members who had both the skills and the political legal know-how to benefit from these new legal rights. This failure naturally led to the further demand that government agencies seek to increase the pool of trained minority manpower. Perhaps as important immediately has been the effect to eliminate excessive requirements for positions which have served as operational handicaps against those from non-middle-class cultural backgrounds, such as requiring more education for jobs than in fact they needed, or tests whose content was not relevant to the position in question. These changes have had one thread in common. They are designed to give minority group members a better chance in the competition for jobs. This has also been the purpose of various compensatory education programs, such as the efforts of different agencies to find qualified minority members who, left to themselves, might not search out available positions. Such efforts have had, in fact, an important historical precedent, which has never been questioned: veterans' preference. That is a form of compensation for a competitive disability that had been imposed on the society. From this principle, qualified veterans have traditionally been given preferential treatment by government agencies and some private employers when their qualifications were demonstrated to be roughly equal to that of other applicants. The stress on affirmative action, however, changed gradually to a demand for specific group quotas for admission to assorted institutions and jobs, and beyond that, in the New York and San Francisco school systems, among many, to proposals requiring the dismissal of qualified teachers and administrators. This change in the conception of equal opportunity from a focus on the rights of individuals to those of groups, as measured by the positions achieved, has meant an extraordinary change in the conception of civil rights in America. Historically, as I've noted, minority groups which had separate discrimination, institutionalized prejudice, or handicaps with respect to skills and education had demanded the elimination of barriers denying individuals access to opportunity. Jews, Orientals, and Italians objected to numerous clauses established, that is, quotas established by institutions of higher learning and other organizations against qualified members of their ethnic groups. They opposed policies designed to perpetuate the advantages enjoyed by members of majority groups. Except for Catholic proposals for state support of parochial schools, which were almost invariably rejected by the majority as un-American, no minority group had previously demanded significant special group advantages. Liberal opinion in this country had always assumed that the egalitarian creed meant advocacy of a universalistic rule of meritocracy, enabling all to secure positions for which they qualified in open, fair competition. Felix Frankfurter, a graduate of Harvard Law School, which he entered before World War I as an immigrant Jewish graduate of the City College of New York, never lost his awe of the meritocratic system. As he noted, what mattered was excellence in your profession, to which your father or your race was equally irrelevant. And so rich man, poor man were just irrelevant titles to the equation of human relations. The thing that mattered was how you did professionally. This traditional liberal left position, implicit in the American creed's emphasis on equality of opportunity, broke down with the demand of the blacks that they be given equality of results, which has meant special group advantage in the form of quotas, which would bring their number up to their proportion in the population in university admissions, various occupations, and trade unions, which control access to jobs. And as the political community came to accept this principle, other disadvantaged groups, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, American Indians, women, have not unnaturally taken up and secured the same demands for a group rather than individual rights, and for group mobility as a way of bypassing the historic process of upward mobility of the individual through the acquisition of skills. Compliance with these demands for special quotas means denial to others of positions for which they are qualified or which they now have. It means that other minority groups, which have been particularly successful in certain fields, are now being asked to give up their gains. This is true of such groups as the Jews, Japanese, and Chinese that have concentrated on education as a means of mobility. More universalistic than other job markets, the civil service has always been a special arena for mobility for disadvantaged groups doing well in school and on examinations. Other minority immigrant groups have used different skills, which they brought from Europe, to gain a special advantage in different job markets. Given the diverse cultural backgrounds of the various American ethnic groups, it is not surprising that their occupational distribution also varies. If the concept of positive group discrimination is accepted, as it has begun to be in this country, the United States will have accepted a version of the principle of ascription, of hereditary placement, to advance equal opportunity. The implications of this change in American values from achievement to ascription have been eloquently stated in an article by Earl Rabb, in which he points out that one of the marks of the free society is the ascendance of performance over ancestry, or to put it more comprehensively, the ascendance of achieved status over ascribed status. Aristocracies and racist societies confer status on the basis of heredity. A democratic society begins with the cutting of the ancestral knot. This by itself does not yet make a humanistic society or even a properly democratic one. There's, for example, a not inconsiderable question of distributive justice in rewarding performance. But achieved versus ascribed status is one inexorable dividing line between a democratic and an undemocratic society. This is the aspect of democracy which represents the primacy of the individual and of individual freedom. It has to do with the belief that an individual exists not just to serve a social function, but to stretch his unique spirit and capacities for their own sake. The right of every man not to have, but to be his best.
We are watching Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset speaking from the Ford Museum at Greenfield Village in Detroit, Michigan. In just one moment, Dr. Lipset will return. If you're in the market for a pair of lo-fi speakers, the Ford Museum is just the place to come and browse. But lo-fi or not, the sounds that came from these speakers helped inaugurate a whole new way of life for America and indeed the world, mass home entertainment. And those old radios led the way to this amazing development: pictures of distant events seen in your own home in magnificent small screen and living black and white. It's all a part of America's social development, which is now being discussed by today's AEI speaker, Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset.
It may appear that the arguments against special prescriptive quotas for minority groups are a form of special pleading by spokesmen of the privileged elements in society. That this is so, viewed from a purely interest point of view, cannot be denied. Yet persuasive voices have been heard from members of the black community, arguing that the black American has a stake in this, a conception of human dignity in which every individual is and ought to be responsible for himself and his actions. Black economist Thomas Sowell points to the demoralizing consequences of the emphasis of quotas on students and faculties in universities. He suggests that the efforts of American universities to fill quotas has meant that a large proportion of black students today are enrolled in schools for which they are ill-prepared. Thus, when the most scholarly, prestigious, highly selective universities admit black students who are less prepared than the whites, they set up a situation in which the blacks so admitted can only feel inadequate. As he presents the problem caused by the policies of elite white institutions, Sowell suggests when black students who would normally qualify for a state college are drained away by Ivy League colleges and universities, then state colleges have little choice but to recruit black students who would normally qualify for still lower level institutions. And so the process continues down the line. The net result is that in a country with 3,000 widely differing colleges and universities capable of accommodating every conceivable level of educational preparation and intellectual development, there is a widespread problem of underprepared black students at many institutional levels, even though black students' capabilities span the whole range by any standard used. This problem is not one of absolute ability, but rather of widespread mismatching of individuals with institutions. The problem is never seen for what it is, for it has not been approached in terms of the optimum distribution of black students in light of their preparation and interest, but rather in terms of how Harvard, Berkeley, or Antioch can do its part, maintain its leadership, or fill its quota. The schools which have most rapidly increased their enrollment of black students are those where the great majority of white American students could not qualify either. However, since such schools typically do not admit underqualified white students, they have no white problem, corresponding to the problem posed for them by their admitting underqualified black students. And hence, as Sowell points out, one seemingly has a situation by setting quotas by which blacks have been systematically mismatched in relation to their educational training, and hence are often led into a situation where, though very able, they are led to feel not as bright as the white students at the given level at which they're placed. A comparable problem has been created by the efforts at universities to fill faculty quotas, according to Sowell. As is obvious from the statistics, the past record of inferior education for blacks means that black America has included very few persons trained to be academic scholars. Moreover, as Sowell points out, many years of academic education are required for anyone, regardless of race, to qualify even minimally as a faculty member, much less as a mature scholar. In short, he points out, there are relatively few competent black scholars in existence, and there's no way to increase the number in the immediate future since it takes many years to produce such people. It is in this context, therefore, that the idea of faculty quotas must be considered. Any goal, target, or affirmative action designed to make the percentage of blacks on faculties approximate that in the general population can only mean reducing quality standards. And this creates a situation in which black faculty are identified with substandard teachers, a phenomenon which can only serve to create demoralization among both black and white students. The emphasis on the need of special help for blacks and some other minorities poses, however, even more serious consequences than its impact on the traditional American emphasis on achievement. As I have noted, it implies that there's something seriously wrong with the blacks, that equality of opportunity is not enough for them. And the very pressure on blacks, which Sowell notices, for them to achieve more rapidly in one decade or generation than any other group ever has, which puts them into situations for which they are not prepared, helps to convince whites and blacks that the latter represent a more difficult problem than other ethnic groups have. In many ways, such efforts facilitate racist attitudes among whites and create feelings of inferiority and self-hatred among blacks. But the facts about black progress in the decade of the 60s alone should serve to counter such pessimism, as well as the insistence that blacks require an inordinate level of preference based on assumptions that there is no way they can make it on their own. In fact, as abundant census data and other studies have shown, there's been an enormous increase in the size of the black middle class in the last decade, and more important than that for the future, a growth in the number graduating from high schools and colleges, to the point where the proportion of blacks entering institutions of higher learning is now very close to that of whites. In evaluating black progress, successful achievement in the occupational structure in the 60s, it is important to note, of course, that this occurred in a period of full employment and economic growth, and that condition seems to be one of the most important conditions for the improvement of various minorities. The position of the black in American society has constituted the great challenge to the American revolutionary dream since the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the document's principal author, voiced his concerns in 1781, even before the Revolutionary War was over, stating with more prescience than even he probably realized, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." Jefferson's country is still paying part of the price he foresaw. It is impossible to envisage an America at peace with itself in which a sizable number of its citizens remain outside the mainstream of national life in abundance because their ancestors were dragooned here from Africa to serve as an underclass for the white population. There is no price that we can be called upon to pay to remedy that situation that can be considered as too costly, except one that humiliates the black population in the context of seemingly trying to help them. As Orlando Patterson noted, when they, like all Americans, require is an achievement of the positive side of rebellion, the affirmation of true dignity and the unaided drive to touch, to build. And as they accomplish this objective, they reaffirm the American Revolution is still an ongoing living reality. As America moves into its third century as an independent state, it must be noted that it has yet to find tentative working answers to the age-old problem of how people of diverse cultural, religious, racial, and economic backgrounds can live together. Troubled times have turned many Americans inward. They seek a sense of belonging to an entity that is smaller than the nation. Ethnicity seemingly has become a source of stability for the larger society. Yet it is important to recognize that a free society must respect the primacy of the individual. Although politics and collective bargaining can work only through the conflicts and alliances of diverse groups, the outcome of such conflicts, particularly as they are resolved by government, must be to guarantee and enhance the equality and rights of the individual. Whether a group, ethnic or other, preserves and extends itself, must be the voluntary action of its members, never the action of the larger society. Thank you.
We've been listening to Dr. Seymour Martin Lipset discussing equality and welfare revolutionary values. Dr. Lipset spoke of the traditional American emphasis on achievement and the problems facing minority groups in the race for this success. This lecture has been one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute dealing with many aspects of the American Revolution and its effect on us all today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Lipset's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute, that's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.